Greetings, everyone, and welcome. 2020 is the 15th anniversary of our first Indiana Center for Middle East Peace program. And so to celebrate our birthday this year, in lieu of being able to gather in person, we've been conducting a series of interviews with activists, scholars, and difference makers in Palestine, Israel, and here in the U.S. You can find them on our Indiana Center for Middle East Peace YouTube page. But today, as part of our birthday celebration, we're delighted to welcome one of ICMEP's dearest friends, Palestinian, Chicagoan, multi-instrumentalist, and musician extraordinaire, Ronnie Malley, for a concert and conversation. Chicago native Ronnie Malley has been performing for audiences since the age of 13. As I said, he's a proficient with a number of instruments, including guitar, piano, percussion, and the oud, which we'll be hearing more about. He studied and performed with Sufi and folk musicians from Senegal, Sudan, North Africa, India, Turkey, as well as with Afro-Peruvian folk artists. He also has been a principal musician, music arranger, and performer for theater productions and documentaries. Ronnie teaches and conducts Arabic music workshops and composes, arranges, acts, and records for various theater productions, film projects, as well as tours with a variety of music groups. Ronnie, it's good to see you. I wish we were visiting in person, but it's very good to welcome you here on Zoom. Would you want to open with a word and a piece of music? It's good to have you here.
Sure. It's so good to be with you, Michael. Like you said, I wish I can be there in person with you, but thank goodness for technology that we have the ability to at least do it this way, right? So I'm very grateful for that. I'll open with a piece for us here. This is a piece that is part of the classical tradition, the repertoire, and it's called Sama'i Bayati, and it's by the composer Ibrahim Al-Aryan. And it's pretty much like a standard that is always an icebreaker whenever you meet musicians from the Middle East, and we all kind of just play it together. So I'll do my own little rendition here for you.
tell us a little bit about your principal instrument that you are holding right now, and that you played that last piece with. Tell us about that instrument that you're playing.
Gladly, Michael. Actually, I kind of fell in love with this instrument when I was about 16 years old. I started off on,
I think, are you not? Are you self-taught?
very much so, actually, on this instrument. The learning curve was slightly easy, though, because I went from playing guitar for many years, to this instrument. But, you know, it took a little while, mainly because, I mean, growing up in Chicago, there weren't very many instructors. Not to mention, I grew up in an age before the internet. So it's not like I can find things on YouTube or anything like that. And so I would literally have to beg people who are going back overseas, please bring back some books with you. Please bring back something for me to learn with. And my first oud was actually a nice Syrian oud from an old maker. But the instrument itself, in the shape that you see it today, I mean, just to give you a little bit of a background on it, it's made out of wood, and it's called al-oud. And in Arabic, the word al-oud means wood. So it's kind of like the word wood without a W, al-oud, and el being the article, the oud. Today we use nylon strings on the instrument. Obviously you see a lot of ornamentation on it. This specific one was actually designed for me by a gentleman named John Vergara, who is a master luthier in New York. And he designed it in the fashion of the Nahat style oud, which was a maker from Lebanon that really revolutionized the way the instrument was made and set a standard, shall we say. This particular one, he actually engraved in mother of pearl on the neck board here, which is a laborious thing to do. Normally, it's just a kind of wooden piece for the neck. You see a body. It's got a really ornamented rosette there as well, as you can see that, and a couple of them. The instrument itself took shape as you see it today, more or less in about the 9th century in Baghdad, Iraq. The origin of the instrument is from the Mesopotamian region as well. So you see busts and pictures of people kind of presenting this instrument, or a stringed instrument similar to it. Initially, this instrument probably started off with 3 courses of strings. Prior to the invention of nylon strings, people were using a lot more gut strings. So animal guts stretched over a period of time would last for a while and resonate very well, but they'd have a very warm tone to them. The pegs were usually made out of wood. Sometimes people would select ebony or rosewood. And the body of the instrument itself could be a variety of different woods, sometimes mahogany, sometimes boboni, sometimes a variety of different woods that they would use depending on the region as well. But Iraq is really credited with being the place where this instrument is born. And in around the about the 9th century, around 8 something, a gentleman by the name of Ziryab took this instrument all the way to Cordoba, Spain, which was at that time really blossoming with Islamic civilization. And indeed, for centuries later, it would still speak Arabic in the Iberian Peninsula. But what Ziryab did is not only take this instrument with him, he added an additional course of strings. At that time, people found things to be a little bit more mystical, so to speak. So each string represented the elements. So you had earth, water, fire, air. And he added a 5th course for him to represent the human soul. And it took shape to be a very versatile instrument that you can play many styles of music on. Today, in fact, it's not only played in the Middle East in Arabic-speaking countries, but you also see this instrument in Turkey, you see this instrument in Armenia, in Greece, throughout North Africa. And so if we take the instrument, al-oud, you start to hear and even look at it and see and realize that it sounds and looks like the lute. And indeed, the European lute comes from al-oud. So even the words lute, al-oud, are similar to each other. And essentially, after the European lute took way and they added frets to it, it eventually became the guitar. So in many ways, you can consider this instrument to be the great-grandfather of the guitar.
I ask you about your one-man show, Ziryab, Songbird of Andalusia. And by the way, we want you to bring that show to Fort Wayne.
Gladly.
Is there anything more that you want us to know about Ziryab and maybe other larger lessons from his life story. And maybe you could share with us a piece of music from your one-man show, or another piece of music that you'd like to share.
Sure. No, absolutely. You know, the Iberian Peninsula and Andalusia in general, the moment you mention Al-Andalus, as what we call it in Arabic, to people from North Africa or through the Middle East, they just know historically that this place holds a very dear place in their hearts, and also for the history of Islamic civilization in general. We're talking about 7 centuries. You know, that is almost 3 times the age of America, that Islamic presence was on the Iberian Peninsula, among, of course, though, Jewish and Christian presence too. The thing that I found to be fascinating growing up hearing stories about, you know, this era was that, you know, they spoke a lot about this notion of convivencia, you know, coexistence amongst the Abrahamic faiths. And, you know, I couldn't help but think that that reminded me so much about, of how much my grandmother would talk about living in Jerusalem before 1948. You know, we owned 3 buildings in West Jerusalem that were taken after the war, that my great-grandfather had built. And in those buildings, she reminisced about how, you know, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, Europeans, and Middle Easterners all lived in this building. They were 3 rather large buildings connected to each other. And I found it to be fascinating every time I hear her speak. I said, you know, why do people keep telling me these people have been fighting for thousands of years, when I can look back to just her, you know, time in history, which, you know, is less than a century ago, and people lived pretty well together. You know, they were, as she put it, they were more concerned with being good neighbors than they were with being good Jews, Christians, or Muslims. And that led me to really look a lot more into Andalusia and understand, well, what is this coexistence that they had among each other? And indeed, you realize that the contribution to the arts in general, and I'm talking about overall poetry, music, even fashion, and of course, the undeniable remnant architecture, which still remains to this day and is the pride of Spain, yet you don't really see the credit going to those who constructed it as much. And the unique thing about this for me was, if people had such a pluralistic society in Andalusia, and we had such a pluralistic society in Jerusalem as, you know, early as the 20th century up to 48, you know, and here we are in America living in such a pluralistic society. Why can't we relive those things? Why can't we take from those and learn from them to see how when people collaborate together and we share, we connect, we can thrive? Of course, no, I don't look at history through rose-colored glasses, you know. I know that there were issues, and there were often political issues, as we see even to this day here in America and overseas. But there were long stretches of time that, you know, people coexisted with each other and shared in one culture. I mean, a perfect example would be, there's a very famous Jewish poet. He was a rabbi and a scholar, and his name was Yehudi Halevi. And he wrote in Ladino, but because Arabic was such a lingua franca at the time, his poetry is also riddled with a lot of Arabic words, and as well as Castilian, because that is Ladino, you know, Old Spanish, basically. And he wrote poems that people turned into songs much later, but he also wrote in a form that actually was born out of Andalusia, that really held the Arabic language on a pedestal in a way, and the form was called muwashahat. And muwashahat are a style of music that the poetry form originated in Andalusia, but it carried on forward even well after the expulsion of both Jews and Muslims from the Iberian Peninsula. So much so now that you have a repertoire of muwashahat from Morocco, a repertoire of muwashahat from Tunisia, from Algeria, from Syria. You know, that is the other thing too, that many people, when we talk about Andalusia, for those who are informed about it, you'll often hear the term the Moors occupied Andalusia, which, yes, there were Moors, which what they're indicating were North Africans from the Moroccan region. However, many of the governance was actually by people of Syrian descent who had fled the persecution of the Umayyad dynasty from Syria, And they actually were some of the first people to govern Andalusia. Of course, many people who had converted to Islam or became Muslim found a way in this new Western frontier of Islam. You know, you can consider it almost to be like the America of that time, but with a very heavy Islamic presence. But with that presence, not only did culture thrive and music, like Ziryab, for example, opened one of the first music conservatories, which you can really kind of consider in Europe, in a sense, in the 9th century. And it was open to all, women and men. And a lot of the pedagogic methods that he actually instilled were carried on and borrowed even as far into European conservatories. That's one small aspect. The other undeniable aspect is the flourishing of philosophy, mathematical principles, science, medicine, of course. You know, we're talking about the era of Ibn Sina, who wrote the canon of medicine that was used in Europe up until the 19th century. And it's heralded as one of the most significant contributions to modern medicine. So the era itself for me was just a treasure trove of knowledge to uncover and to try to rectify some of the omitted histories that I grew up with here in America. You know, we didn't learn about slavery. We didn't learn about the transatlantic slavery as much as we should have. We didn't learn about the Islamic influence on Western society or the Renaissance. You know, medieval society in Islam, and it wasn't just Islamic. The Christians that were in Andalusia at the time were what they called Mozarabs, and they actually adopted Eastern Christian Orthodox philosophy, and that's what they practiced. However, we know how the story ended up in 1492 with the reestablishment of the Reconquista, with the Catholic monarchy kind of coming back and asserting itself as we are the identity of Spain. But even today, if you go to Spain, there's no way that you can consider the Catholic identity the only identity. Just look at any architecture, listen to the music, listen to the flamenco, listen to how the Moroccan musical influence, the Eastern musical influence is still there, not to mention the instruments. I guess that's apropos to a song that I can present that's actually in the Ziryab as well. And this is a song that was made famous by a Moroccan Arabo-Andalusian singer. His name is Abdessadek Shkara. And Abdessadek Shkara in about the 1960s created a new revival for people to appreciate the Arab Andalusian tradition that at that time wasn't as popular. But once he came out, especially with this song, it just became extremely popular. So you'll hear Arabic and some Spanish in it as well. Music. But I'll give you a little taste of, this is a piece that I do in Ziryab, and it's a piece I was fortunate enough to perform with Moroccan Arab Andalusian musicians. And it's called Bint Bladi, I guess how appropriate of a title, which means daughter of my country. And daughter of my country, oh, how I love thee, educated and artist. This is how I love you. Ya Bint Bladi.
سلموني عينيك يا بنت بلادي، سلموني عينيك وزين اللي فيك، قلبي كي يبغيك وزين اللي فيك، قلبي كي يبغيك يا بنت بلادي، يا بنت بلادي، سلموني عينيك يا بنت بلادي، سلموني عينيك وزين اللي فيك، قلبي كي يبغيك وزين اللي فيك، قلبي كي يبغيك يا بنت بلادي. صغيرة ومزيانة قارية وفنانة، صغيرة ومزيانة وقارية وفنانة، حبك حبك أنا يا بنت بلادي، يا بنت بلادي، سلموني عينيك يا بنت بلادي سلموني عينيك وزين اللي فيك قلبي جاي بغيك وزين اللي فيك قلبي جاي بغيك يا بنت بلادي يا بنت بلادي سلموني عينيك يا بنت بلادي سلموني عينيك وزين اللي فيك قلبي جاي بغيك وزين اللي فيك قلبي جاي بغيك يا بنت بلادي.
Beautiful, beautiful.
Thank you. So you can hear the influence there too of also flamenco music, which derives largely from a lot of Middle Eastern music. Indeed, some people assert that the word flamenco is a compound Arabic word that's falah manqub, which literally means disgruntled peasant. What that and in a sense, if you listen to flamenco music, it is that. It's passion, it's crying, it's lament, you know. It's almost like the Iberian blues in a sense.
Yeah. I like that Iberian blues. I might use that and not quote you.
It's okay, you know. I don't have any copyright on that word yet. Yet.
You know, I've been following your career, Ronnie, and in the last number of years, you've become increasingly busy traveling with theater productions. You've been working much more with theater productions, world tours. I remember you went with at least folks from the Sarabi Ensemble on a world tour after you left here, etc. Tell us about some of the productions or tours in which you participated and how they've touched your heart. And maybe think about one piece of music or two that you could play from one of the tours.
Sure. You know, I've been very fortunate in my life, and a lot of it had to do with a simple thing, which was just follow your passion. If anybody ever asked me to, you know, about any advice about anything that they see as a semblance of success, it really, all it is just keep doing what you're doing. The road will never be easy. Life is not easy, but the more you persevere, the greater the reward at the end sometimes, you know. I lived in the corporate world for many years and still worked in the music field as a weekend warrior, you know, playing at weddings and nightclubs and whatnot. But there came a point where, you know, I needed to see something that was beyond just being commercial with my art. I didn't want to just go show up, collect a paycheck and go home. I mean, as nice as that is, and all respect to those who view it in such a way, I needed to do more. I needed to find the expression within me and utilize whatever talents God may have given me to try to do something with that, to make a difference, not make money, but really make a difference. And so I made that decision in 2004 to just kind of quit the corporate world altogether. I went from working in retail management to working in banking. I was a real estate appraiser for many years as well, and even a business owner of a cafe. And, you know, money does not bring happiness to people. You know, I know materials that money can buy can sometimes bring people a little bit of happiness, but to search for true happiness, you must follow your passions, no matter what it is. And in the end, it will pay off because you only live this life once. And so in 2004, I made that decision. And I said, I'm going to leave that world. I took a massive pay cut to do so, but it allowed me to assess what value is in life. And value does not always equate a dollar or a currency symbol. Value is, you know, there is happiness. Value is in the relations that you make, the networks of people that you create. And that's what I started to see when I started to just play music. So in about 2004, I made a decision. I studied French here for about 6 years and in America. And I said, I need to go someplace because the war in Iraq was about to start. And I had just left the corporate world thinking to myself, how could I have paid my taxes to a country that's going to go unjustly create a war against the people that are my people, you know, the place where my instrument comes from, you know, where civilization comes from, the cradle of civilization, writing, all of those things. And to just think that I'd be culpable in any way in that, I needed a break before I was bombarded by the news media to try to sway me or distract me. And so I put together a little group. That was my first real major group, which was called Lama Jamal. And the Lama Jamal was actually a group that was a trio, and we just kind of impromptu put something together to travel overseas and just see what it was like to do a DIY type of tour. But it allowed me really to put forth then what I wanted to do: original music, a trio that exposed Middle Eastern music, but in a modern context, and in a context that was accessible to Westerners as well, as people who came from the tradition. And so we recorded an album and ended up going to Paris and just kind of busking and touring and playing a few little places here and there. And so when I came back, I made the decision that I need to move away from here for a little bit. And so I kind of backpacked throughout Europe for a little bit and kind of mainly used Paris, France as my base. As soon as I came back from Paris, I was offered a role as a onstage musician, as well as a co-arranger for a piece called Mirror of the Invisible World, which was by the Persian writer Nizamuddin.
Sure.
And so they had turned this into a play, and it was at a regional theater called the Goodman Theater. And it was by a Tony Award-winning writer and director named Mary Zimmerman. And after that experience, I ended up working with her on a lot of theater productions. I had no idea, first of all, that theater would have been any realm that I would find myself working in, but nor did I think that anybody would really find any interest in this Middle Eastern music that I grew up playing with my family band of any interest. Yet here it was coming in interest because I spoke Arabic, because I was playing Middle Eastern instruments, and I can consult on some of the context of these plays. So Mirror of the Invisible World was the first thing I kind of did. And then I went into Arabian Nights, which was also at a local regional theater. And we ended up touring that to Berkeley Repertory Theater in California and Arena Stage in Washington, D.C. And from that, my relationship grew with this director and ended up working on The Jungle Book, which was the Disney production co-produced by the Goodman Theater and Huntington Theater in Boston. And on that, I was a co-music director as well as a music consultant, because up until that point, I had been studying Indian music as well for about 5-6 years. And so I was able to help them piece together a group that represented Indian tradition as well as the jazz swing tradition that you hear in the classic movie. And that was one of the greatest experiences ever, because I actually got to sit in the same room and work with Richard Sherman, who wrote all of the music to these Disney songs and these Disney movies. And from there, I kind of kept in touch with this particular director, and we ended up doing a famous play called The White Snake, which is a very famous story by an ancient Chinese fable. And I was asked to not only perform in the play as a musician, but also consult on composing the music and from the Chinese perspective of music. And that's where my ethnomusicology background kind of kicked in, and I did thorough research on the instrumentation. And lo and behold, also discovered that the oud and the pipa, which is its counterpart in classical Chinese and Eastern music, are related to each other. And so it's amazing to see the confluence of similarities. And the most recent production, in between all of that, I ended up just really working a lot in theater, creating a lot of different music groups like Surabi Ensemble, which we ended up doing a tour of Vietnam, Spain, Senegal, and Portugal. And our intent for that was, we called it the Global Peace Tour. This was just last year, actually. And that particular tour, our intention was to go as ambassadors of America and Chicago, specifically because that's where our funding came from. And we wanted to just kind of highlight to people that, America is more than what you see on TV. Here we are, we represent America, and it was a range of diverse people with us on this tour. And we would play all forms of songs, our original pieces mainly, and we even had a peace song that one of our members had composed. And after that, I came back and just worked on small little projects, and I was tapped to come and perform, consult, and act in a Broadway musical called The Band's Visit. And the unique thing about The Band's Visit actually is 10 years ago, I was doing a residency over at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival when we did The White Snake. And I received a call from these folks, the producers, asking if I would consult on them because I had done a reading for the play in 2009 in New York. And they saw that I was doing, the music, and I helped them with the Arabic language and the dialect, and I sent them over some of the music. And the irony of it was just before they had called me, I had already seen the movie, and I loved it because it was so sweet. It's an interesting film, that can easily be looked at and say, boy, this thing is riddled with politics, but there isn't any politics. And ultimately what it is, I guess apropos to our later conversation, is that it's about, in 1996, an Egyptian orchestra is invited to a small town in Israel to perform at an Arab cultural center that's opened up there. The unique thing about the movie that I enjoyed was half of the cast was Arab Israelis or Palestinian Arabs, who are well known in, who hold Israeli citizenship, and they're well known in the spheres of, we're talking about Salah Bakri and a variety of really well-known Arab actors, Palestinian actors in Israel, in Israeli TV. And the other half were just various, Israelis, but almost all of them were either Mizrahi or Arab Jews or Sephardic Jews, actually. So I found it really fascinating too, because the music that was composed in the film was actually by a Palestinian composer named Habib Shahada, who I knew of as well from Nablus. And so I thought, wow, what an amazing collaboration. I had visited Palestine in 1993, right after the Oslo, and before the Oslo Accords. And I went back in 95 after the Oslo Accords, filled with hope, to see, I want to go back and live in, my family's country and live in our home and our land. And I thought, a movie like this was just, it really harkened to something like that. And so when we started talking, the producers and I said, this is a beautiful movie, a beautiful story, but there's one thing. It's about a band, and there's barely any music in it. I said, we need to do something about that. And from here to there, about 10 years ago, we talked about it, and we came up with the idea that it should be a musical. And so I sent them a lot of, my consultation of a lot of songs that I grew up listening to, some of the Arabic, and maybe a direction they can go to make this a little bit more of an apolitical story and something that's more about a human kind of story. And so here we go, fast forward 10 years later, and I was asked to perform on the North American tour. I was actually asked to do it before it went to Broadway. However, I was already booked with some of my theater engagements, and they opened up at the Atlantic Theater in New York. And a year and a half later, it went to Broadway. And honestly, I couldn't have been happier. I felt like I was an uncle to this show, and I had friends of mine who were on the show. And even then they had asked, well, if you can't do it, do you know anybody that can? Because it's one of those very few shows that actually did a few things. It actually portrayed people of Middle Eastern origin in a positive light as cultured, educated, sophisticated people who had a human side to them. Then you also saw on the stage instruments like al-oud, darbuka, all of these Middle Eastern sounds that, not to my knowledge, had never graced the stages of Broadway. And more importantly too, is in the actual play, there was Arabic and Hebrew and English. So when I was asked to do the Broadway production of it, I was initially just asked about music. And then the producer said, do you act too? I said, sure, I can act. Said, can you come out for an audition in New York? Came out for the audition. They gave me the role of one of the Egyptian musicians. Kamal was my role. And with speaking lines and on-stage musician as well. And because I was one of the few people that spoke Arabic, I also ended up becoming the Arabic dialect coach for the show.
Well, play us a piece of music either from that show or from our one of your other productions, maybe your world tour or something else that would highlight
Sure thing.
What you've been up to.
Sure thing.
And
this is a piece.
What it is.
This is actually an original piece, and it's called Zahma. I originally wrote this piece actually when I was in my early days in Paris, but then I didn't record it until I was with the Surabi Ensemble, and it's become part of our repertoire now with the Surabi Ensemble. So this is an original piece called Zahma.
You've you've already shared a couple of times in our conversation how important your Palestinian roots are. I mean, I know you're a Chicagoan, but you're also very deeply embedded in Palestinian heritage, tradition, culture. Uh, it's a simple question, but it's not so simple, really. How do you carry Palestine in your heart,
I mean,
and how is it
you know,
expressed in your art?
obviously I grew up not only being Palestinian, I grew up with my grandparents, living in the same home with them. So Arabic was what we spoke in the home. A Palestinian dialect is what we spoke. I also come from a unique two backgrounds in some ways because, as we all know, no one culture is a monolith. I mean, I can go to any state alone and find different things from the urban centers to the rural centers. So it was really unique growing up with a background like my father's from a little town around Ramallah, and this is a town called Betunia. And my mother, though, is from a town called Lifta, which is a suburb of Jerusalem, but they were always Jerusalemites their whole lives, living in West Jerusalem in the Romema neighborhood specifically.
I know both of
And,
those little towns.
yeah. And, Betunia is really unique, too, because in Chicago especially, people from Betunia have been coming here since World War One. It's very unique. I have relatives who were part of the United States military as far back as World War One. One of my second cousins, my great uncle, my grandfather's brother, served in the U.S. Army in World War II. His son ended up becoming a master sergeant of the U.S. Air Force as well. And I've had cousins who were sergeants, who were in Vietnam, who were in, really part of the American fabric. However, we've never really let go of our roots or ancestry. A lot of that had to do with, growing up in the neighborhood where I did in the southwest suburbs of Chicago, Oak Lawn and Bridgeview and this area. And from the historical perspective, up until about 82, a great deal of the Palestinians, because that's really the majority of the Middle Easterners that live here. We have the largest Arab population in Chicago is Palestinian. And after that, you might see Jordanian. And then you get into the smaller minority Arab groups like Syrian and Lebanese and whatnot. But Palestinians pretty much make up the majority of the Arab community that is here. So in many ways, I didn't feel so disconnected. They had businesses. 63rd Street, for example, in Chicago was known as Little Arabia. Sometimes people still today, would call it like Little Palestine. And there are even other areas now where many of these people ended up relocating years later that they still call Little Palestine. And almost every store on that street, on 63rd Street, where I really kind of grew up a lot, would go and frequent, every shop had Arabic written on it. Every shop was a bakery or a restaurant or a grocery store or some other service that was being provided. And something that helped really fortify that for me too was, especially on 63rd Street, was working in my uncle's bakery for a little while. And that really gave me insight into, the Arab culture a lot more, but I also learned how to make pita bread, baklava, all kinds of foods and whatnot. The unique thing about also growing up in such a Palestinian diaspora here is you were never disassociated from your roots. You went to weddings every week and felt like you were overseas. You ate Middle Eastern food every day. There were enough shops around that you felt like you were almost shopping in a Middle Eastern district or something. And so that's where my roots growing up, Palestinian, really kicked in. And it also didn't hurt that my grandfather and his friends actually helped establish and build the Bridgeview Mosque in 1982 here.
Oh, wow.
And that was where I went and I would study Arabic, actually in a very much of a secular fashion. And my teacher was somebody who was also a Chicago public school teacher as well. And she was related to me. She was from Betunia as well. I guess that was the other thing that, we never forgot our identity, plus growing up in the 80s and 90s. This was a time when, parents, especially immigrant parents, they didn't want their children to have accents. So it's not like they really made a point to say, you must learn your second language. And, you know, I don't know if that was correct or not, but I was very grateful that I was living with my grandparents and we had the opportunity to actually to do that. And we learned about our culture that way. And I mean, look, anytime I say I'm Palestinian, I've made a political statement.
Absolutely.
There's no way around it, you know? But I also chose, go ahead. I'm sorry, Michael.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, but I also chose to not forego my American identity, but also think about where my grandmother's roots were from, Jerusalem. You know, I'm half Jerusalemite. What does that mean? And I had to explore that. And what that meant to me was you have to respect the Jewish religion, you have to respect the Christian religion, and you have to respect the Islamic religion. All three of these things are inseparable from each other. They are part of the Abrahamic faith. And though I grew up Muslim, my father and my mother really drilled in our heads that we must respect people from these faiths and to really make a distinction between that which is a colonial oppressor and that which is a person who happens to be of a certain faith.
Well, and I wanted to just press that just a little bit more and then ask you to play a piece of music. But yeah, I mean, it's one thing about respecting individuals and from different faith traditions and respecting those faith traditions themselves. But as you know, these faith traditions can be hijacked. Palestine is occupied. It's being ethnically cleansed by colonial imperial Israel with help from the United States. So I guess, and you and I have talked about this privately. Do you consider your music, your work, as part of resistance? You said just by saying I'm Palestinian, it's a political statement. Do you see yourself as part of a resistance movement? How do you think your music inspires, urges, participates in the liberation movement of the Palestinian people?
100%. First of all, you know, I adhere to the philosophy of resistance through existence. You know, I might not be, my style might be different. You know, I might not be pumping my fist in the air, but you better well be sure that if I'm writing something or I'm doing a piece, it's always on my mind. My identity is who I am. You know, but at the same time, I ascribe to, you know, knowledge is the greatest power we can have. And, you know, even the prophet once said that if you can't win the minds of your enemy, try to win their hearts. For me, that's what I try to do in many ways. You know, I've had students who were not only Jewish, they were cantors in the synagogue. And they wanted to learn about maqam and all of these things. And sometimes, you know, with a name like Ronnie Malley, they didn't immediately assume you're Arab or Palestinian for that matter. Yet when they come, I make no qualms to hide it. I've never done that. In fact, even on Broadway, even working with this production, you know, and other productions for that matter, I would make it very well known because I find it to be a point of that I can actually explain to them about it. I explain to them, first of all, where is Palestine? You know, not Pakistan, as some people mistaken it, and then explain to them that, you know, don't give me this narrative that you think you've bought into, or that people have been fighting for thousands of years there. I can give you proof positive, you know, I am proof positive, my family is, that that's not the case. However, here is what the case is. This is a colonial entity that has occupied a land that had people already living there of the three faiths. You know, I don't have to get into what is and what's going on right now there. But, you know, if there were ever a classic case of ethnic cleansing, yeah, that's exactly what it is. I mean, my first visit to Palestine, which fortified my true, you know, I don't want to say patriotism, but my true pledge to my homeland, you know, the homeland of my ancestors and my grandfathers and you know, we're talking centuries here, generations. And I remember the first time going there and seeing a kid who was maybe 2 years older than me pointing an M16 in my face, you know, at a little roadblock. And I'm thinking to myself, why are you doing this? I mean, I'm obviously not posing a threat. And fortunately, my father was with us. And, you know, my father took the reins and kind of lowered the guy's weapon and said, there's no need to be pointing that at anybody right now.
I can picture your father doing that.
It was, I will never forget that moment in my entire life because it set the stage for me to understand what's really happening here. I heard about it growing up in America. I obviously was a product of it. I wouldn't even be here if the situation wasn't the way it was. And but I remember wanting to go back and live there so badly and just be part of the culture. And it's funny because a lot of what Israel and the Zionist movement really in general had strived to do is they thought that after several generations we'd forget where we come from, who we are, and our culture. But ironically the contrary is what has happened. My children know that they're Palestinian. Their children will know that they're Palestinian. All of the communities that I know here are now not only poised with their education and the knowledge and the privilege that they've had of growing up in a relatively safe environment where bombs are not falling on them and schools are not being shuttered, to actually take this the next step. We now have a person in Congress.
That's
That
right.
is going to be exponential. That is going to be, right now, the BDS movement, take it with a grain of salt as however you will. The one thing that I can say about it, though, is it has created an immense awareness of the situation that is there, and that people are actually even saying the word Palestine, something that in the 90s, I didn't think was even going to be possible.
Is there a piece of Palestinian music that you can play for us now?
Sure. I'm going to play you a little medley, and this is a Dupka medley, but I play it because it's so dear to me, because one of the songs my grandfather, when he saw me starting to kind of pick up the oud and learn the oud, it was the song he would always ask for. And this is a medley that has this song in it. The song that he asked for was called Ya Zarif at-Tul, O tall and handsome one, where are you going? Don't you know that your country is better for you? So it's very appropriate into the context of the conversation. But I'm going to give you a little medley that you might hear at a Palestinian wedding, but these are songs that are traditionally Palestinian.
على دلعونا وعلى دلعونا وراحوا الحبايب ما ودعونا على دلعونا وعلى دلعونا راحوا الحبايب ما ودعونا لا بدي امي ولا بدي بيني بدي حبيبي اسمر اللون هلا هيك على غربة ولادك أحسن لك يا زريف الطول ووقف تاكل لك رايح على غربة وبلادك أحسن لك خايف يا ظريف تروح وتتملك وتعاشر الغير وتنساني أنا على امك وارجع للحنان ما حنية غير في بلادنا يا ظريفة تقول وقف تاكل لك رايح على غربي وبلادك أحسن لك خايف يا ظريف تروح وتتملك وتعاشي للغير وتنساني أنا ما تخاف من الله وما تخاف من الله تفت قلبي وما تخاف من الله وين عرم الله يا وين عرم الله وين فيك مسافر وين عرم الله ما تخاف من الله وما تخاف من الله فديت قلبي وما تخاف من الله حبيبي تاركني ورايح وين يا حبيبي حضر نصيبي حضر نصيبي تاركني ورايح حضر نصيبي وين عرم الله وين عرم الله والفي مسافر وين عرم الله ما تخاف من الله ما تخاف من الله فديت قلبي وما تخاف من الله فديت قلبي وما تخاف من الله فديت قلبي وما تخاف من الله.
La ilaha illallah. There is no God but the one God.
Correct.
One reality, right? One truth, one reality, one beauty, one. Yeah, that's beautiful.
Thank you.
I have one last question and one last piece of music, I hope.
Sure.
You've studied, collaborated, played, performed with musicians from all over the world. Part of the mission, as you know, of Indiana Center for Middle East Peace is intercultural encounter. And Ronnie, one of the things you've said, although we have many differences, music and art remains universal elements. This oneness that you were just singing, chanting about, remain universal elements that help illuminate our commonalities. So as we close this conversation and concert tonight, say more about this aspect, this impact of music and art and your mission as a musician. And then if you could play us one more song that maybe embodies that universal message.
Sure. Growing up learning music, especially in band and in Western music, but having a family band, my father and my brother musicians, and we would play together. I grew up in the Western public school system, and what they taught us was music began with Bach. And, I kept thinking to myself, that can't be, I know, our ancient ancestors had to have played bones or something, or just the human voice is such a powerful thing. And that was a lot when I really discovered Andalusia, and I found that missing link of music that many people like to try to make that convenient leap from ancient Greece to the 15th century. All of a sudden, everything flourishes. Well, there's a lot that happened in between that time. And what I discovered in that research was that for a very long time, even the word music was not necessarily part of the Arabic lexicon or the vocabulary. Any art that they called music, they actually called it hendesat as-sawt, which literally means the construct of sound or the engineering of sound. And it gave me insight into what I hold to be true today that really makes it even more poignant that this is such a universal thing that everybody can really kind of access, is that they talked about the influence of sound on everything, not only ourselves, but the revolution of the earth. The earth's rotation can be measured as a note if you measured it in hertz. The frequency of the revolution of a black hole can be measured, and you can actually attribute it to a note. If it were audible to the human ear, one of the black holes in our galaxy actually revolves in B flat. The Earth actually is in B. And every single star, every single galaxy, every single sun and planet that you see there revolves to its own note. Now, if you don't think that that's universal, I don't know what is. Even in the book of Genesis, when, God spoke or let there be light, that's speaking as actual vibration. So vibration, what is this? But vibration, a sound wave oscillating. I can't see it. I can measure it and then graph it, sure. But with my naked eyes, I can't see it. But yet in it resides this divinity that we don't even begin to comprehend, to be quite honest with you. Which is why, again,
I preached a sermon one time. The title was "In the Beginning Was the Beat."
Well, I'm going to use that one, and I'm not going to.
I'm sorry.
I'm going to use that quote and not attribute it to you. In the beginning, there was the beat. Yeah, very much so. And what's fascinating is, with my background in the Middle East and in Islam and everything, I just uncovered so many writings about this very topic, that they would not view music only as an art for consumption, but rather as a science that would help us understand the natural world, physics, the astronomy, the revolution of stars, rhythms, motions. Even when Pythagoras was coming up with intervals for, musical scales, it's a mathematical equation. And anytime anybody plays music on anything, it's really applied physics. So it's a marriage of these worlds that are so universal to all of us. Most people might not realize it, but, the waves of an ocean, the rustling of a tree, or the howling of the wind, or the song of a bird, or any sound in general. I mean, you're hearing something that has been bestowed upon us all to comprehend and understand. So, I mean, I know it's a little deeper than maybe the question you asked, but that's really where I've gone into with sound. How can I express musically that which is, something so universal? You wanted a piece to play you out that kind of represents something like that, other than me just sitting here and saying, to allow you to realize.
How do you express the ineffable? That's the question.
So
play us out, man.
It's just an instrument of expression, and it's limited in its sound capacity, but I want to pursue that to its fullest extent. This is a piece that I'm going to shorten, but it's part of the classical repertoire. And honestly, this is one of the first classical Middle Eastern pieces that I performed. But if it's a little long, you can roll it out with the credits, okay?
Thank you.